Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Connie Lester, and I am the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. Today's podcast features Jessica Clawson, a doctoral fellow in education at the University of Florida. Ms. Clawson's article, Administrative Recalcitrance and Government Intervention, Desegregation at the University of Florida, 1962 to 1972, looks at the role of two successive UF presidents, J. Wayne Wrights and Stephen O'Connell, in the integration of the university. She argues that the two men utilized practical segregationist strategies to delay integration until federal mandates forced desegregation. In addition to the featured article, this volume contains articles by Antonio Rafael de la Cova and Eric Jarvis, as well as a historical note by Patrick W. Doyle and 10 book reviews. Dr. de la Cova's article, Cuban Exiles in Key West During the 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878, uses census data to understand the community of Cuban exiles in Key West. Eric Jarvis's article, Secrecy Has No Excuse: The Florida Land Boom, Tourism, and the Smallpox Epidemic in Tampa and Miami, continues his research on the intersection of disease and tourism. Dr. Jarvis won the Arthur Thompson Award for an earlier article on encephalitis outbreak in St. Petersburg in 1962. Today's podcast was conducted by Dr. Robert Casanello, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Central Florida.
Okay.
I asked Robert Casanello to join me so he can talk about the Florida Historical Society meeting and symposium. Robert, can you give our listeners some details about this event?
Yes, I can. Each year the Historical Society holds a meeting where historians come to present their ongoing research, get feedback, and ideally improve their research for future publications. So in a sense, these meetings work as the first draft of history. So for people interested in the history of Florida, it can be quite an exciting place.
When and where is the meeting this year?
It'll be in Jacksonville at the Hyatt Regency Riverfront from May 26th through the 28th.
Can anyone attend?
Yes, anyone can attend. You don't have to be a member of the Florida Historical Society, but you do have to pay an admission. There's a registration fee of $80 to attend all 3 days, and $50 if you just want to attend one day. Now, the fee is necessary because the fee helps to pay for the meeting spaces, the events, and the guest speakers. Other events might be an additional charge if they involve lunch or dinner or have any other additional expenses.
Can you tell our listeners about the speakers and the events scheduled?
Yes, the Julian Prescott Memorial Lecturer this year is Larry Rivers. He's president of Fort Valley State University and author of the book Slavery in Florida, among other books on African Americans in Florida. The title of his talk is The Florida Civil War You've Never Heard About. I'm on a plenary panel discussing the urban history of Jacksonville, along with Abel Bartley and Alan Bliss. There's an awards luncheon, a picnic at the historic park in Mandarin, a movie night, and a reception hosted by the Jacksonville Historical Society. Not to mention a book exhibit with new and used books on Florida history and all of those paper presentations.
That sounds great. Where can our listeners get more information?
They can go to the Florida Historical Society website at http://www.myfloridahistory.org/annual meeting.
Thank you, Robert, and I hope to meet some of our listeners at the meeting this year. Now we will listen to your interview with Jessica Clawson.
Okay, Jess, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, I am Jess Clawson. I am a graduate student in the College of Education at the University of Florida, and I study the history of education here. And I also got my master's degree from the University of Florida's History Department.
Okay, now we're interviewing you about the article that's forthcoming in the Florida Historical Quarterly. And could you tell us a little bit about how you came to that research in the first place?
Yeah, I began this research when I was a master's student in the History Department here at the University of Florida, and I had come to UF from a background as an activist in my undergraduate years at William and Mary in Virginia. And in those years we were dealing with a lot of racial inequities, on the campus and in the town around it, and so I was interested in these kinds of issues to begin with. And so when it came time to write a master's thesis, it seemed obvious to me that I should look at UF and its history with race and desegregation, because I knew there had to be a story there, and this is the story I found. So it was a natural suiting for me, I think, to come in and do this kind of research here.
To me, it would seem that the 10 years of your study represents a transformation of college campuses, and I think in some way the country as well. So, how would you say, with regard to student life, how did UF reflect the rest of the country in the beginning and the end years? So, in 1962, what was student life like that would reflect America, and then in 1972, what was student life like that would reflect America in that year?
Well, those 10 years, especially the latter part of them, represent a real moment of protest, across the country. We tend to think of it as something that goes on in the South, but it was really going on everywhere. And civil rights and activism and the Black freedom movement have been going on for decades. It can be traced back to Reconstruction. But the high 60s, that time from about 1968 to 1972, are a time people really think of when they think about the 60s and the student movements and civil rights. And so the 10 years covered here represent, at Florida and at the national level, a convergence of different movements. You have the Black civil rights movement and the Black freedom movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, the very beginnings of the gay rights movement. But, history, especially popular history that tends to reach non-academic audiences, tend to focus more on certain schools where the big violent stories happened, like at Kent State, where people actually died in protests. And the University of Florida was in every way a Deep South school. It had a protest culture, too. It had the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay liberation movement. And so part of the point of this study is to put Florida back into the history of the student protest movement. So in many ways, UF very much reflected the rest of the country throughout these 10 years. In 1962, the protest movement had not really gotten underway on a lot of college campuses. In some ways, it still felt like the 50s. It was a time of consensus, and you had the Black freedom movement and civil rights movement leaders working to gain more access to institutions like universities, but there wasn't a large presence of African Americans on college campuses in the South at the time, and white students hadn't really gotten into their protest movement the way they would in another 6 years. And so by 1972, the war in Vietnam and the draft had spurred many students into anti-war protests, and the second wave feminist movement was well underway. And so we also had a sizable enough population of Black students on many campuses, including this one, that they could form organizations like the Black Students Union. And so there are always nuances, but I found that UF in many ways very much reflects what was going on in the rest of the country. And I think we think sometimes that Florida might be different, that it's more moderate on race relations, but it really isn't. And, Paul Ortiz's book, Emancipation Betrayed, and Irvin Winsborough's edited volume, Old South, New South, Down South, both really show how much UF was part of the whole Deep South culture and how Florida was part of that culture. And so UF wasn't actually really any more moderate than any other school. It just didn't always draw the same national attention as some other places did.
And that's a great point, I think, that you picked up on in the article, this idea that Florida wasn't different, because there's this sort of civil rights mythology that somehow Leroy Collins and all of this and the tourism represented kind of a different way than the rest of the Deep South did as far as civil rights goes. But in your work and a lot of the other work that you identify, we see that really wasn't the case. That what was going on in other parts of the country as far as civil rights goes was also going on in Florida. What interested me when I read your article, and kind of the first connection for me was not so much civil rights, but it was the 1920s fight over the teaching of evolution in the state of Florida, specifically in the public schools. And what seems to me to be this connection was the role of the presidents in the fight over evolution. And what I found was interesting in the 1920s was that the presidents of the public universities, both at the University of Florida and at the time Florida Women's College, but eventually will become Florida State, were that these two presidents at the public universities really kind of tried their best to acquiesce to the legislation as much as they could. Now, they did it in very different ways. One of the presidents was more accommodating than the other. However, they both really kind of, stuck their finger in the wind to see where it was blowing and then develop policies based on that. And what was always interesting in that story, and I thought, was something that I wish someone would do a lot more on, was the reaction of Hamilton Holt in Rollins College, who was president there at the time. And, being a president of a private university, he really didn't have to, bend to the whim of the state legislature. And so he kind of took a whole different route and criticized the legislature. And what's kind of interesting for him is that he didn't necessarily disagree with the legislature and the whole thought of what went into that specific policy, though it never successfully passed. But he said college campuses should be free and independent, and we don't need the legislature meddling into the academic life of college campuses. And to get around to your article now is what kind of interested me was that here you have the public universities or the public colleges in Florida give the president sort of this leadway to go outside of this role as politician, that you kind of described taking place at the University of Florida. And so I'm wondering if you think the same thing, that did the fact of these two presidents at the University of Florida being at the University of Florida in a public institution, what role did that play in them having to respond the way that they did to these policies?
Well, I want to talk separately sort of about both presidents. I talk here about J. Wainwright and Stephen C. O'Connell, and they're both big names on the UF campus. Our student union is named after the Wright Student Union, and then, the big stadium where our basketball games and whatnot take place is the O'Connell Center. And so they're both very much remembered here, which I think is something worth keeping in mind. But the University of Florida was the state's flagship university, and, as we spoke about before, Florida was a state committed to an appearance of racial moderation, although this was a veneer and not really the truth. And so it did matter to the state government, like Governor Ferris Bryant, who was governor when Rights was president, that UF not attract lots of attention from civil rights workers and the press. And it would improve the state's image to have UF desegregate very quietly. And the university did not rely almost entirely on alumni donations the way private schools might. And so Rights, didn't necessarily have to worry about the entire funding structure caving in if he admitted black students. And so Rights had a really funny relationship with all of this, I think. He didn't have a political background when he became president. And he sometimes struggled with trying to keep the state out of the school's business. Nonetheless, oftentimes, his actions with the state were not always to the students' benefit, the way I think that he might. I'm not sure how he would have reacted in any of these issues in a private setting, but, for instance, when, as president of a public university, he had to deal with the Johns Committee, which was a state investigative committee that was meant to remove homosexuals from state jobs. And this committee investigated UF in 1958. And Rights complied with the investigation rather than make an effort to protect his students and faculty, many of whom were fired or expelled. And I think that as part of the state, as president of an institution that was part of the state, he felt compelled to cooperate. And furthermore, he did not alone determine the moment of desegregation. The Governor Ferris Bryant wanted to prevent the state from the style of desegregation that Mississippi was experiencing with dogs and fire hoses and a great deal of national attention. Florida's tourism and citrus industries he thought were worth protecting, and so Bryant encouraged Rights to prepare the path for smooth, quiet desegregation. And the plan worked for as long as Rights was president. The Gainesville Sun didn't really cover it. Outsiders involved with the civil rights movement stayed out. And Rights and Bryant agreed with this sort of philosophy of token desegregation before a lawsuit could be filed or before the civil rights community could really get on the case. Joe Crispino has referred to this as practical desegregation, and I think that's a really useful term. This sort of strategy worked to avoid and downplay the effectiveness of the civil rights workers. But it also meant that the students didn't really experience genuine integration into the university. O'Connell, he had a much more political background. Before he became president, he had been on the Florida Supreme Court, and he'd been appointed as Chief Justice of the court before he resigned to become U.S. president. And while he was on the court, he heard the Virgil Hawkins case about desegregating the U.S. law school, and he voted against Hawkins and against desegregation. So while he was president, students of all races wrote him letters asking that he take their needs more seriously, particularly the needs of black students. But he ignored them until the federal authorities from the Health, Education, and Welfare Bureau investigated the university and saw that it wasn't sufficiently integrated. At the same time, campus protests were starting to crop up around the country, and through all this, O'Connell was insisting that change should happen slowly. And as a state politician, and I think he saw himself as a state politician, this rhetoric of slow change was effective. That was the way people, who were pro-segregation spoke about these issues. But as a president of a university, speaking to students, this came across as sort of hollow. And after the 1972 protest I write about here, in which students occupied the administration building to agitate for more rights for black students, state politicians commended his efforts to not let, communists and other agitators take over. And so he was very much in line with the state's interests in that way, but students didn't feel very good about how he handled things. And I'm not sure if he would have, I think he probably would have taken a harder line on segregation had he been the president of a private college instead of a public university. And if you look at the private universities in the 1960s, even top-name schools that were committed to non-discrimination on paper, like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, they admitted very few or no black students at the time. And at those schools, black people had to agitate for their rights in the same way they did at other schools. But I'm not sure that Harvard really had to represent the entire state of Massachusetts in the same way that UF had to represent Florida at times. And I think that the pressure to desegregate initially would have been much lesser on these men if they had been presidents of private universities. And the federal government wouldn't have been able to hold federal funding over them to do things like integrate the football team. It's worth remembering that the University of Florida is a land-grant school, and so it has to serve the people of Florida. If it isn't doing that, because it's segregated, it's susceptible to lawsuits. And ultimately, that's the legal argument that was made in the desegregation of many land-grant universities in the South. And so I do sometimes wonder if O'Connell especially wished that he could have been president of a private university and didn't have to deal with the same issues around desegregation and funding and states' interests. But I think that at the end of the day, O'Connell and Wright both would have continued to work to preserve the interests of the traditional elite, whether they were at public or private universities. And they might have had an easier time maintaining segregation at a private university. And it's possible that, desegregation at private universities that they were in charge of would have come later after they had left. And so I think they felt constricted to some degree, and they felt they had a line to walk between the state and the students. But I'm not sure they would have always come down on the side of the students or on the side of desegregation had they had, the freedom associated with a private university.
What do you think the lesson someone working in education administration should take away from this story?
Well, I think that the experiences of Wright and O'Connell speak to the larger roles of presidents in furthering or, in their cases, forestalling diversity agendas at public universities. And so diversity issues, whether directly related to desegregation or raising an integrated university's profile as a place that's friendly to a variety of student backgrounds, are pressing and attention-drawing, and they can harm an otherwise successful president's reputation.
Okay, Jess, I want to thank you for letting us interview you for this podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is a peer-reviewed, scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the Quarterly are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Go to www.flhs.org myfloridahistory.org for membership details. In addition, find us on Facebook and give us feedback on the podcasts.
Great.